Good morning, class. This morning I was listening to a podcast, How I Built This with Guy Raz, an NPR podcast. And this particular episode is on Chesapeake Bay candles, Mei Xi. And I want to bring up this episode as a particular part of this episode that really resonated with me in this class. She was an immigrant from China. She came over here to the U.S. and she started her own business doing household goods. And eventually she found out that candles was a big industry. And this is, by the way, this is back in about 95, 96 when she started her business. And she got into Nordstrom's and Bloomingdale's. So she had scented candles, and Bloomingdale's and Nordstrom both loved her product. In order to get into a store like that, what you would typically do is you would have to call a buyer. So each store, Bloomingdale's, Nordstrom, Macy's, there's somebody in that organization called a buyer. And it's the buyer's job to talk to other companies. So for example, candle companies, they would get a bunch of different candles from different manufacturers and smell them and smell them, test them, make sure they are a quality product. And then typically they would do an initial order. Well, they'll bring them in for like a test market, see if they like it, and then bring them on full time. So now Mei, in this particular podcast, had already gotten into Bloomingdale's and Nordstrom, but she really wanted to get into Target. And the reason why is at the time, Target was kind of this breaking barriers type of store. It wasn't necessarily high end, but it also wasn't low end. And they kind of had that middle of the market, affordable, but also nice products. So, and it's in this point of the podcast I'd like to share with you. We're going to listen to it and then see some takeaways. There's some really interesting things here of how she got into, or maybe she didn't get in. Let's see how she approached Target in getting in. And I like this because she's not a salesperson. She's an entrepreneur. She's an accountant. She's everything. She is a salesperson, but she's wearing a lot of hats at this point in her startup. So let's see her techniques and what she did in order to try to get into Target.
Who do you call there?
So it was pretty straightforward. You can find the name of the buyer. There's a telephone extension, and you can leave messages.
And you call that person?
So this is the time when I always say you cannot give up, even if you call for a whole year, which I did.
A whole year?
Every month at the same time, I called and I left messages.
And you said what?
I said, hi, the same thing I did with Nordstrom and the same thing I did with Bloomingdale's.
Okay, what was your pitch? What'd you say on the phone?
My pitch was that I have a great candle, and now I can even say it's sold at Bloomingdale, which usually Target buyers would listen in and they would say, wow, they're already at those stores. We want to be those stores. So they would usually return your phone, but not the buyer.
Good pitch.
And nothing, silence?
Nothing, silence.
So how did you finally break through? What happened?
So I have to say this is probably one of my biggest failure is that I started to get frustrated, and I said to the receptionist, she's not returning my call. So she said, I think you could call her boss and make a complaint. Which I did. I basically say, well, one of your buyers have not made any return phone calls. 2 minutes later, the buyer called. And she said, this is so-and-so, and just so you know, it is not the way to start a relationship. And she hung up on you.
Yikes.
Wow, so you were finished at Target.
I'm done. So every time I called again, if it's her voice, I didn't even leave my voice message.
But you kept calling even
But I kept calling.
But you were shut out at that point.
I basically was, yes. So I waited until the next year in April, and it was a very different voice. It was a very cheerful voice.
It was a new buyer.
It was a new buyer.
Hey.
And I left my message and I got it back in 2 days.
Wow, 2 days.
A new day has finally come, because as you can imagine, every new buyer wants to make a difference. They want to make their mark. And she heard me, so she said, why don't you come? And I did. But
Where's their headquarters?
They're based in Minneapolis.
Right, of course.
So I flew there, and she was very young. She was probably in her late 20s, and she came in, and she was sitting down listening to my pitch, but halfway through she has to get up and smell the candles from the bottom. Candle buyers usually want to smell the candles from the bottom. That's when the oil settle into the bottom, and you smell the most from the bottom.
And so what'd she say? Did she put an order in?
She basically, in a big store, it's a lot process involved.
Right.
They ask you capability questions, pricing questions. They cherry pick what they want. So I didn't expect anything to happen. But she asked me, if I put it in my store, how soon can you ship? That was the moment when I froze. Because I said, what do you mean? Are you going to test? Because I heard they test a lot. I said, do you test in 50 stores or 100 stores? She said, no, Mei, I want to put it in 750 stores.
Wow.
And I said, oh, in that case, then I started to count.
Okay, so wow, right? From going to nothing to somebody ghosting you, not even returning your calls, to going into all of those stores. Pretty impressive. Some things that may have stuck out to you that stuck out to me was, one, she even admitted that her mistake was to go above the boss, right? She was so patient. She waited a year calling on a regular basis. She got a little impatient. She called the boss. She stirred things up. I mean, hindsight is always 20/20. She didn't know that was going to happen. She wanted to get into Target. She was willing to try anything. So I think that was really good on her for, I think not knowing the future, I may have done something similar. You may have done something similar. But then what happened at the end? People move out of companies. You might not connect with a certain person in the company right now that you're trying to sell to, but that employee may move on, may get promoted. They may move on to the competitor, or they may retire. So that's a great lesson that, that persistence can really pay off. And then she was doing her pitch, and halfway through she's got a pitch, and then they just grab the candle and start walking around. That can absolutely happen during a sales pitch. As a salesperson, you have to be ready for anything that could happen when you're trying to sell something. They could just get up and start talking, or, oh, I got to take a call, or I like this, don't, stop your presentation. So I just love this example of, the cold call. We did the sales call script in this class, what kind of call and how those calls could manifest. And then later in this class, we're going to be doing a sales pitch where you have a sales deck. And you could see that sometimes your deck needs to be able to have some wiggle room, because you never know which direction a sales conference or sales call meeting will go. Awesome story. Congratulations to her. And you could just see that hard work and dedication can pay off.